The morning my husband drove me to the airport was supposed to be completely ordinary. Just another quiet goodbye before a work trip. But looking back now, that moment was the beginning of everything falling apart. Chicago was cold that morning. The kind of crisp autumn air that wakes you up the moment you step outside. Justin helped me load my suitcase into the trunk of the car, just like he always did. He smiled, asked if I had my passport, and reminded me not to forget the charger for my laptop. Small things. Normal things? The kind of things a caring husband would say. On the drive to O'Hare, Justin kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting casually on my knee. To anyone watching, we probably looked like a couple who had been married for years and still enjoyed each other's company. He asked about my training in Seattle and joked that when I came back, I'd probably be the one teaching the class instead of attending it. When we pulled up to the terminal, he quickly got out and helped me with my suitcase. Then he wrapped his arms around me and pulled me into a long hug. "Don't worry about anything here," he said softly. "Just focus on your training. I'll take care of Stephen." I remember nodding and smiling back at him. At that moment, everything seemed normal. But there was something about the way he said it. Something slightly rehearsed. Something just a little too perfect. When I walked toward the security checkpoint, I turned back once to wave goodbye. Justin was already pulling his phone out of his pocket. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But what Justin didn't realize was that the goodbye at that airport wasn't the beginning of my trip. It was the moment his secret life was about to collide with the truth. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 36 years old. And for the past 10 years, I've worked as a senior sales associate for one of the largest retail chains in Chicago. My job is simple on paper. Sell products, build relationships, and keep customers happy. But the real skill behind sales isn't talking. It's reading people. You learn to notice hesitation in someone's voice. You learn to spot when someone is hiding something. You learn that the smallest changes in behavior can reveal the biggest lies. For most of my career, those instincts helped me close deals and earn promotions. I never imagined I would one day need them to understand my own husband. Justin Carter and I had been married for 11 years. He was 37, confident, charismatic, and extremely good at what he did. As a regional sales manager for an electronics company, Justin spent a lot of time traveling, meeting clients, and managing teams across different cities. People liked him. A lot. He had that natural ability to make anyone feel comfortable within minutes of meeting him. At company parties or neighborhood gatherings, Justin was always the center of attention. The guy who remembered everyone's names. The guy who could turn a quiet conversation into a room full of laughter. From the outside, our life looked exactly like the kind of life people expect when they hear the phrase, normal family. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Chicago in a modest but comfortable house. We had a small backyard where our son liked to play soccer. Our 8-year-old son, Stephen, was energetic, curious, and endlessly fascinated with building things out of whatever materials he could find around the house. Most evenings followed the same routine. Dinner at the kitchen table, homework afterward, and then a little television before Stephen went to bed. Justin and I would sometimes sit on the couch afterward talking about work or future vacation plans. It wasn't a perfect life, but it felt stable. Justin always told people he was proud of my career. When I received promotions at work, he celebrated with me. When long hours or difficult customers left me exhausted, he encouraged me to keep pushing forward. Even my coworkers often joked that I had somehow managed to find the rare combination, a husband who supported his wife's ambition. For years, I believed that too. The Seattle training trip had come up only a few weeks earlier. My company was hosting an advanced sales program for top performers from different regions. It was a 3-day event focused on leadership, negotiation strategy, and management training. If everything went well, it could lead to a corporate promotion within the next year. When I first told Justin about the opportunity, he immediately encouraged me to go. "You'd be crazy not to," he said. "This is exactly the kind of thing that gets you noticed." He even insisted he would handle everything at home while I was gone. "I'll take Stephen to school. I'll make dinner. "Don't worry about anything." At the time, his support felt genuine. Now I realize it was convenient. As we stood in the airport that morning, Justin checked his watch more than once. I noticed it, but I told myself it was probably because he had work meetings scheduled later that day. He hugged me one last time before I entered the security line. "Call me when you land," he said. "I will," I replied. Then I turned and walked toward the scanners. A few minutes later, I was sitting at the gate, watching planes move slowly across the runway through the large glass windows. Travelers rushed past, pulling suitcases behind them, while announcements echoed through the terminal speakers. Everything about the airport felt normal, predictable, routine. Soon my flight began boarding. I found my seat by the window and fastened my seatbelt as the cabin slowly filled with passengers. When the plane began taxiing down the runway, I looked out at the city of Chicago stretching across the horizon. Somewhere down there, Justin was already driving away from the airport. At that moment, he believed he had just sent his wife 2,000 miles away. He believed he finally had the freedom to live the secret life he had been building for months. What Justin didn't understand was that by the time my plane left the ground, I already knew exactly where he was going next. The airplane cabin was quiet once the seatbelt sign turned off. A few passengers opened laptops. Others leaned back and closed their eyes, already trying to sleep through the 4-hour flight to Seattle. A flight attendant pushed a cart slowly down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. But I barely noticed any of it. I kept replaying the morning in my mind. Justin's voice, his hug, the way he checked his phone. Something about the goodbye at the airport felt wrong. Though I couldn't explain exactly why, it wasn't one single moment. It was a collection of tiny details that didn't quite fit together. For most of the flight, I stared out the window at the endless white clouds below the plane. Because the truth was, the strange feeling at the airport hadn't appeared suddenly. It had started months earlier. The first time something felt off happened late one evening while we were sitting in the living room after Stephen had gone to bed. Justin's phone rang around 10:30. At first he looked at the screen without answering, almost as if he were deciding what to do. Then he stood up. "I'll take this outside," he said casually. That alone wouldn't have been unusual. Justin often handled work calls at odd hours because of his management role. But that night the conversation lasted almost 20 minutes. Through the living room window, I could see him standing on the porch, pacing slowly back and forth while he talked. His voice was low and serious, and several times he glanced toward the house as if making sure I wasn't watching. When he finally came back inside, he placed the phone face down on the table. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just a client problem." His answer came too fast. At the time, I tried not to think too much about it. But over the next few weeks, that moment stopped being the only one. The late-night phone calls began happening more often. Sometimes Justin would leave the room to answer them. Other times he would silence the call and send a quick text message instead. I also started noticing how protective he had become about his phone. Justin had never been secretive before. For years, we both left our phones on the kitchen counter or coffee table without thinking about it. But suddenly he began carrying it everywhere, even to the bathroom. Whenever a message appeared on the screen, he angled the phone slightly away from me before reading it. Each small detail by itself meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Around the same time, Justin started mentioning more business trips than usual. "I've got to meet a client downtown tomorrow," he would say. Or sometimes, "The company wants me to visit another office for a day." Again, none of that seemed impossible. His job involved travel, but the frequency increased, and the explanations became shorter. Then one evening I was sitting at the kitchen table paying bills when I noticed something else. The credit card statement. Justin and I shared several accounts, and I usually handled the monthly payments simply because I was the one who kept our finances organized. As I scanned through the list of transactions, a few charges caught my attention. An expensive dinner at a restaurant in downtown Chicago. Another charge from a wine bar I had never heard of. A boutique store that specialized in baby products. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The baby store made no sense. Stephen was 8 years old. None of our friends had recently had children. And Justin had never mentioned buying a gift for anyone. Later that night, I casually asked him about the charges. "Oh, that," he said quickly. "Client dinners? And the baby store?" I asked. Justin shrugged. "One of the guys from work just had a kid. We picked up a gift." His answer sounded smooth, but something about it didn't feel natural. The problem with being in sales for as long as I had was that you eventually learned how to recognize rehearsed explanations. Customers used them all the time when they tried to negotiate prices or hide hesitation. Justin's tone had that same rehearsed quality. Still, I said nothing. I told myself I was overthinking things, but my instincts refused to quiet down. In sales, instincts are rarely random. They're built from years of observing human behavior, noticing tiny signals most people ignore. And every instinct I had was pointing in the same direction. Justin was hiding something. Instead of confronting him, I decided to watch more carefully. I started paying attention to patterns. When he received messages, when he left the house, how often he traveled, what excuses he used. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't even hint that I was suspicious. I simply observed the way I would observe a difficult client during a negotiation. The turning point came one evening a few weeks later. Justin had just gotten home from work and went upstairs to take a shower. In his rush, he left his phone sitting on the kitchen counter. I wasn't planning to look at it. At least, not at first. But then the screen lit up. A new message notification appeared. The name at the top of the message was simple: Amanda. For a moment, I just stared at the phone, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. The message preview appeared beneath the name. 3 short words. "Doctor confirmed today." I didn't touch the phone. I didn't open the message. I simply stood there staring at the screen until it went dark again. Somewhere upstairs, the shower was running. Justin was humming softly, completely unaware of what had just appeared on his phone. In that moment, something inside me changed. I walked away from the kitchen counter and sat down at the dining table, staring at nothing for several minutes, because suddenly all the strange behavior from the past months began connecting together. The phone calls, the secret messages, the unexplained expenses, and now a message mentioning a doctor. That night, Justin slept peacefully beside me, breathing slowly and evenly. But I stayed awake for a long time staring at the ceiling. Because once you start seeing the signs of a lie, it becomes impossible to unsee them. And deep down, I already knew something important. My husband wasn't just keeping a secret. He was living an entirely different life. The message from Amanda stayed in my mind long after the phone screen went dark. "Doctor confirmed today." 3 simple words. Yet they echoed in my head the entire night. Justin slept peacefully beside me, breathing slowly, completely unaware that I had seen the notification on his phone. His arm rested casually across the blanket as if nothing in the world had changed. But for me, something had shifted the moment I saw that name. I didn't wake him. I didn't confront him. Instead, I lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling while the quiet house seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. The next morning, everything looked exactly the same on the surface. Stephen rushed through breakfast while talking about a science project he was excited about. Justin skimmed through emails on his phone while drinking coffee. I packed Stephen's lunch, tied his shoes, and kissed him goodbye before the school bus arrived. From the outside, we looked like any other family starting a normal weekday. But inside my mind, the investigation had already begun. Once Justin left for work, the house became silent. I sat at the kitchen table for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to ignore what I had seen. It would have been easier to pretend the message meant something harmless. But instincts don't disappear once they've been triggered. They demand answers. I opened my laptop and started with the simplest thing I could think of: the name Amanda. At first, the search results were useless. Dozens of Amandas appeared in Chicago alone. But then I remembered something from the message notification the night before. The way the name had appeared on Justin's phone looked like a saved contact, not just a random number. That meant there was a chance they knew each other through work or social circles. So I checked Justin's social media connections. Scrolling through hundreds of names took time, but eventually one profile caught my attention. Amanda Brooks. She looked to be in her early 30s. Her profile photo showed her standing in front of a modern office building, dressed in business attire with a confident smile. According to her bio, she ran a small tech startup based in Chicago. I clicked through the rest of her profile. Photos from networking events, pictures from business conferences, dinner meetings at upscale restaurants. At first glance, everything looked normal. But as I continued scrolling, small details began appearing. In the background of one photo from a startup event, I recognized someone standing behind Amanda near the bar. Justin. The picture was taken about 4 months earlier. I stared at the image for a long moment before continuing to scroll. Another event photo appeared a few weeks later. This time Justin was sitting at a table across from Amanda, holding a drink while several other people laughed around them. The timestamp on the photo matched a night Justin had told me he was out with clients. A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest, because suddenly the client dinners from the credit card statement started making sense. I kept digging through Amanda's posts. Eventually, I found something that made my hands go still on the keyboard. A picture taken outside a medical clinic. Amanda stood near the entrance, smiling softly at the camera, one hand resting lightly against her coat. The caption read, "New chapter beginning." The post had been shared just a few weeks earlier. At the time, the message probably seemed vague to anyone reading it. But combined with the notification I saw on Justin's phone the night before, it suddenly felt very clear. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Then I began calculating timelines. The strange behavior had started roughly 6 months ago. The late-night phone calls, the unexplained dinners, the sudden business trips. Amanda's clinic photo had been posted about 3 weeks earlier. The message on Justin's phone mentioned a doctor confirming something. My stomach tightened as one possibility began forming in my mind. Amanda might be pregnant. And if she was, there was only one reason Justin would be receiving that kind of message. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring at the screen. Anger started to rise inside me, sharp and immediate. My first instinct was to confront Justin the moment he walked through the front door that evening. I imagined throwing the phone message in his face and demanding the truth. But experience held me back. Years in sales had taught me a rule that applied far beyond business. The moment you reveal what you know, the other person starts hiding things better. If Justin realized I was suspicious, he would delete messages, move money, change his story. Evidence would disappear overnight. And once that happened, the truth would become much harder to prove. So instead of confronting him, I closed the laptop. That evening when Justin came home, I greeted him exactly the same way I always did. We ate dinner together. Stephen talked about school while Justin described a meeting he had attended earlier in the day. His voice sounded relaxed and normal. If I hadn't seen that message, I might have believed every word. Later that night, Justin kissed me goodnight and rolled over to fall asleep. But as I lay there listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, one thing had already become clear. This wasn't just an affair. The pattern of behavior, the clinic photo, the message about a doctor, everything pointed toward something much bigger. Over the next few weeks, I continued watching carefully. I tracked dates and small details. I paid attention to where Justin said he was going and when he came home. The more I observed, the clearer the picture became. By the time my company announced the training trip to Seattle, the truth was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Justin wasn't just cheating on me. He was preparing for another family. And the woman named Amanda was carrying his child. The confirmation didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle revealing a picture I had never wanted to see. Over the next few weeks, I stopped being a wife who trusted her husband and became someone quietly gathering evidence. Justin never noticed the change. Every morning I packed Stephen's lunch, kissed Justin goodbye, and waved as he drove to work. I smiled during dinner conversations and laughed when Stephen told stories about school. But behind that calm routine, I was paying attention to everything. Patterns began to appear quickly. Justin started leaving the house earlier than usual twice a week. On those mornings, he claimed he had breakfast meetings with clients downtown. But when I checked the timestamps on the credit card account, the charges didn't appear at any restaurants. Instead, I noticed something else. Parking garages. The same medical district garage showed up repeatedly. The location was only 2 blocks away from the clinic Amanda had posted about in her photo. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Justin wasn't just meeting Amanda. He was attending doctor appointments with her. I continued watching quietly. One evening, Justin told me he had to work late because of a major presentation the next morning. He left the house around 6 and said he'd probably be home after 10. At 9:30, while Stephen was already asleep upstairs, I opened the credit card account again. Another charge appeared. A small Italian restaurant downtown? The same restaurant I had seen on the statements months earlier. Without thinking too much, I grabbed my coat and car keys. The drive took about 20 minutes. The restaurant was dimly lit and crowded with couples enjoying late dinners. I walked slowly past the front window, trying not to draw attention to myself. And there they were. Justin sat at a corner table across from Amanda. She looked different in person than she did in the photos online. Her hair was pulled back casually, and she wore a loose sweater instead of business clothes. But the thing that caught my attention immediately was the way she rested one hand gently on her stomach. Justin leaned toward her as they talked, his expression soft in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in months. For a moment I simply stood there outside the window. A strange calm settled over me. I had expected anger. I had expected heartbreak. Instead, I felt something colder. Certainty. I turned around and walked back to my car without going inside. When Justin finally came home that night around 10:30, he found me sitting on the couch reading a book. "How was your meeting?" I asked casually. "Long," he said with a tired sigh. "Clients can be exhausting." I nodded sympathetically. "Want some tea?" I asked. "That would be great." As I walked into the kitchen, I realized something important. Justin had no idea I had seen him, and that meant I still had the advantage. Over the following days, I began documenting everything carefully. Dates, locations, expenses, phone call patterns. Justin had always assumed I handled our finances simply because I liked staying organized. He had no idea those same financial records could quietly reveal the truth about his double life. The evidence grew quickly. Restaurant visits, hotel charges, doctor appointments in the medical district. And then, one afternoon, I found something even more significant. I was reviewing our shared email account when a receipt appeared from a private maternity clinic. The email confirmation was addressed to Amanda Brooks, but the payment had been made using Justin's secondary credit card. The appointment description was simple: ultrasound consultation. I stared at the screen for a long time. The truth was now undeniable. Amanda wasn't just pregnant. Justin was fully involved. He wasn't hiding a mistake or a temporary affair. He was building another life. That night, I sat alone in the living room after everyone had gone to bed. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I thought about Stephen sleeping upstairs. I thought about the years Justin and I had spent building this family. And I thought about the future Justin clearly imagined for himself with Amanda. The betrayal was enormous. But the worst part wasn't the affair. It was the planning. Justin had been carefully constructing this second life while still living comfortably in the first one. He assumed I would never find out. He assumed I would remain the loyal wife managing the home while he prepared for a new child somewhere else. The thought made something inside me harden. Because if Justin believed I would simply accept this betrayal, then he didn't know me at all. Over the next few days, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking strategically. Anger might feel satisfying for a moment, but strategy wins in the long run. Justin had secrets, but he also had weaknesses: financial accounts, property records, business connections, legal responsibilities. I began reviewing every detail of our shared life: mortgages, investments, insurance policies, trust accounts. And as I examined those documents, one realization became clear. Justin had been planning a future with Amanda, but he had forgotten one critical detail. Everything he owned was still tied to me. Every account, every asset, every legal document. And suddenly, for the first time since I discovered the affair, I understood something powerful. Justin thought he was the one controlling the situation. He believed he had time to slowly transition into a new life with Amanda. But the truth was very different. Because the moment I decided to act, his entire world could collapse. He just didn't know it yet. The moment I realized Justin believed he was in control, I stopped feeling like a victim. Instead, I began to see the situation the way I had approached difficult negotiations in my sales career. Information first, action later. For the next several days, I quietly studied every financial and legal detail tied to our marriage. Justin trusted me with the paperwork because I had always handled it. Bills, tax records, mortgage payments, investment accounts. Those things had always been my responsibility. That trust became my greatest advantage. One evening after Justin went to bed, I opened my laptop at the dining table and began reviewing documents I hadn't looked at closely in years. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a car passing outside. I started with our bank accounts. Justin's salary from the tech firm was deposited into our joint checking account every 2 weeks. From there, the money was distributed automatically: mortgage, utilities, school tuition, savings contributions. At first glance, everything appeared completely normal. But when I opened the secondary credit card statement again, the pattern returned. Restaurants, parking garages near the medical district, boutique purchases, and something new: hotel reservations. Not frequent, but consistent enough to reveal a routine. Each reservation appeared on nights Justin had claimed he was working late. I documented every date carefully. Then I moved on to the investment accounts. Years earlier, Justin and I had opened a brokerage account together when his company's stock options began paying off. The account held a mixture of technology stocks, index funds, and a small real estate investment trust. The balance had grown significantly over time. What Justin never paid attention to was the legal structure of the account, because although the money came primarily from his income, the account itself had been opened under joint ownership, meaning every dollar technically belonged to both of us. I continued digging. The house title, also joint ownership. The car, registered under both names. Retirement contributions, listed with spousal beneficiary rights. Justin had been planning an entirely new future while forgetting a basic legal truth. He couldn't separate his life from mine overnight. And if things turned into a legal battle, those details would matter. A lot. But financial records were only one piece of the situation. I also needed to understand exactly how serious his relationship with Amanda had become. The opportunity to confirm that arrived sooner than I expected. One afternoon while I was organizing paperwork in Justin's home office, his laptop buzzed with a notification. He had forgotten to close his email program before leaving for work. I didn't plan to search through his messages, but the subject line on the newest email caught my attention instantly. Appointment confirmation, Brooks Family Clinic. The sender was the same private maternity clinic I had seen earlier in the payment receipt. For a moment I stared at the screen. Then I clicked the message. The email confirmed an ultrasound appointment scheduled for the following Monday morning. Amanda Brooks. Patient. Justin Miller. Emergency contact. My hands went cold on the keyboard. The appointment notes included additional information. Week 16 prenatal evaluation. That meant Amanda had been pregnant for nearly 4 months. 4 months. I quickly calculated the timeline. That lined up almost perfectly with the night Justin told me he had traveled out of town for a company conference. The memory suddenly felt different now. At the time, he had returned home with stories about business meetings and networking dinners. But the truth was obvious. The conference had likely been a lie. I closed the email slowly and stepped away from the desk. The confirmation removed the last remaining doubt. Justin wasn't hiding a short-term affair. He was preparing for a child. And judging by the way he was attending medical appointments with Amanda, he fully intended to stay involved. I sat down on the edge of the couch in the office and stared at the floor. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, anger began rising again. But this time it felt sharper, more focused. Because Justin had made a decision months ago. He chose to build a new family while still living comfortably inside the old one. He assumed he could quietly replace me once everything was ready. The thought would have broken me a few weeks earlier. Now it only strengthened my resolve. That evening, Justin came home from work looking relaxed and cheerful. He kissed my cheek as he walked into the kitchen. "Long day," he said while loosening his tie. "But at least tomorrow should be easier." I nodded while stirring pasta sauce on the stove. "That's good." He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. "You know," he continued casually, "I might have to travel again in a few weeks. There's a project developing in Seattle." The comment made my stomach tighten slightly. Seattle. The same city where my company had just announced the upcoming training conference. For a brief moment, the coincidence felt strange, but I kept my voice calm. "Another trip?" I asked. "Yeah." Nothing confirmed yet, though. He took a drink of water and leaned against the counter. "Work has been crazy lately." I watched him quietly. Justin had become very good at telling lies. But he had also grown comfortable with them. Too comfortable. And that overconfidence was exactly what would eventually destroy him. Later that night, after Justin and Stephen were asleep, I returned to the dining table with my laptop. I reviewed every piece of information again. Financial records, appointment confirmations, restaurant charges, hotel reservations. A complete timeline began forming in front of me. And as I studied the evidence, one final thought became clear. Justin believed he had months to prepare his new life with Amanda. But the truth was far simpler. He had no idea how quickly everything was about to change. Because while he continued building his secret future, I was already preparing the end of it. The decision to act didn't come in a single dramatic moment. It formed slowly, the way a storm gathers strength far out at sea before anyone on shore notices the clouds. For days I reviewed every document again and again, making sure I understood exactly what Justin had tied together with me legally and financially. The deeper I looked, the more obvious something became. Justin had been careful with his secrets, but he had not been careful with his assets. Our marriage had lasted long enough that almost everything important in his life carried my name alongside his. The house we lived in, the investment portfolio, the brokerage accounts that held his company stock options, even the savings accounts connected to Stephen's future education. Years earlier, Justin had insisted joint ownership made things easier. Now that same decision created a very different reality. Because if our marriage collapsed suddenly, he wouldn't walk away with everything he expected. Late one evening, after Justin and Stephen were asleep, I made the first quiet move. I called a lawyer. Her name was Rachel Adler, a family law attorney recommended by one of my colleagues at work. She specialized in high-asset divorces and complex financial cases. When she answered the phone the next morning, her voice sounded calm and professional. "How can I help you today?" I hesitated for only a moment. "My husband is having an affair," I said. "And I believe he's expecting a child with the other woman." Rachel didn't react with surprise. If anything, her tone remained steady, almost analytical. "Do you have evidence?" she asked. "Yes." "How extensive?" I glanced at the notes spread across my dining table. Financial records, doctor appointments, restaurant charges, email confirmations. There was a brief pause. "That's a strong start," she said. "But what matters most is timing and strategy." We scheduled a private meeting that afternoon. Walking into Rachel's office felt strange, as if I were stepping into a life that didn't belong to me yet. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Several framed diplomas hung neatly on the walls behind the reception desk. Rachel greeted me personally and led me into a conference room. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 40s, but her confidence filled the room immediately. "Let's start from the beginning," she said. For the next hour I explained everything. The message from Amanda. The restaurant dinner I witnessed. The clinic appointments. The financial records. Rachel listened carefully without interrupting. Occasionally she wrote notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair. "Your husband believes he has time," she said. I nodded. "He thinks he can transition into a new life slowly." "That's common," Rachel replied. "People involved in affairs often assume their spouses won't discover the truth until it's convenient." She slid the legal pad toward me so I could see her notes. "But the key advantage you have is preparation." Rachel began explaining the legal structure of my situation. Joint ownership meant half of nearly every asset Justin believed was his actually belonged to me as well. If divorce proceedings began under the right conditions, the courts would freeze financial accounts immediately to prevent either spouse from moving money. That meant Justin wouldn't be able to secretly transfer funds to Amanda or prepare a new household easily. But Rachel emphasized something even more important. Evidence of financial support for an affair partner during a marriage can significantly affect settlement outcomes, she explained. Restaurant bills, hotel stays, medical payments. If Justin had used marital funds to support Amanda's pregnancy, those records could become extremely damaging in court. I felt a strange sense of clarity as she spoke. For the first time since discovering Justin's betrayal, the situation stopped feeling chaotic. It began to look like a strategy. Rachel outlined several steps. First, we would quietly secure copies of every financial document connected to Justin's accounts. Second, we would prepare legal filings in advance. Third, we would choose the right moment to serve divorce papers, preferably when Justin was least prepared to react. "Timing matters," Rachel said. "Why?" I asked. "Because once he receives the documents, the court automatically freezes certain assets and restricts financial movement." She leaned forward slightly. "If your husband is planning a new life with another woman and a baby, losing immediate access to his money will create serious complications." I understood what she meant. Justin had been planning months ahead, but he had assumed the transition would happen on his schedule. Rachel closed the folder containing my documents. "You also mentioned a work trip to Seattle," she asked. "Yes. A training conference next week." Her eyes narrowed slightly as she thought. "That might actually work in your favor." "How?" "If your husband believes you're out of town, he'll likely feel more comfortable continuing his routine with the other woman." She tapped her pen lightly on the table. "And that gives us a window to act." The idea formed quickly after that. While I traveled to Seattle, Rachel's office would finalize the paperwork. If Justin continued visiting Amanda, as the financial patterns suggested he would, he might not even realize what was happening until it was too late. When our meeting ended, Rachel walked me to the door. "You're handling this very calmly," she said. "I'm trying." She gave a small nod. "Anger is understandable, but preparation wins cases." Driving home that evening, the city streets looked strangely normal. People walked along sidewalks. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Restaurants filled with couples enjoying dinner. Somewhere in that same city, Justin was probably texting Amanda about their next doctor appointment. He believed the future was unfolding exactly the way he planned. But the truth had already shifted. Because for the first time since the affair began, Justin wasn't the only one making plans anymore. And when my flight to Seattle took off next week, his carefully constructed life was about to collide with a reality he never saw coming. The week before my trip to Seattle passed with an eerie sense of normalcy. Justin behaved exactly the way he always did. He kissed me goodbye in the mornings, asked Stephen about school during dinner, and occasionally complained about long hours at work. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than usual. That calm confidence told me something important. He truly believed he had everything under control. Every evening after Justin and Stephen went to bed, I returned to the dining table with my laptop and a growing stack of documents. Rachel had given me a checklist during our meeting, and I followed it carefully. Bank account statements, investment portfolios, mortgage records, insurance policies, tax filings from the past 5 years. I scanned everything into encrypted files and emailed copies to Rachel's office. She responded quickly each time, confirming which documents were most important for the case. One night she called me directly. "You're doing exactly what you need to do," she said. "Is it enough?" I asked. "It's more than enough." Her confidence helped steady my nerves. But the situation still felt surreal. Because during the day I continued playing the role of the trusting wife. On Wednesday evening, Justin mentioned another late meeting. "I might not be home until after 10 tonight," he said while putting on his jacket. "Okay," I replied calmly. "Drive safe." The moment he left the house, I opened the credit card account again. 20 minutes later, the expected charge appeared. The same Italian restaurant downtown. I didn't drive there this time. I didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. Instead, I focused on preparing for my trip. The training conference in Seattle would last 4 days. My company had already booked the flight and hotel weeks earlier, and Justin knew about the trip. In fact, he had encouraged it. "Good opportunity for networking," he had said casually. Now I understood why he had been so supportive. My absence would give him complete freedom. Rachel called again on Friday afternoon. "The paperwork is ready," she said. My heart skipped slightly. That fast. "We've prepared everything in advance. Divorce filing, financial disclosure, asset protection orders." She paused briefly before continuing. "The only thing left is timing." I looked at the calendar on my desk. My flight to Seattle would leave Monday morning. "Let's do it while I'm gone," I said. Rachel agreed immediately. "Once the documents are filed, the court will issue temporary financial restrictions. Your husband won't be able to move funds or access certain accounts." The idea felt both terrifying and empowering at the same time. For months, Justin had been secretly building another life. Now the foundation under his feet was about to disappear. The weekend arrived quickly. On Saturday morning, Justin took Stephen to soccer practice while I stayed home organizing travel documents. I watched them drive away from the kitchen window, feeling a strange mix of sadness and determination. Stephen deserved stability, and that meant I had to end the lies surrounding our family. Sunday night came faster than I expected. My suitcase stood beside the bedroom door, already packed for the Seattle trip. Justin lay in bed scrolling through his phone while I double-checked my flight confirmation. "What time is your flight tomorrow?" he asked. 8:30. He nodded. "I'll drive you to the airport." "Thanks." For a moment I studied his face in the soft light from the bedside lamp. He looked comfortable, unworried, completely unaware of the storm approaching. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The drive to the airport felt strangely quiet. Justin focused on the road while soft music played through the car speakers. "Text me when you land," he said as he pulled up to the departure curb. "I will." He leaned over and kissed my cheek before helping me unload the suitcase. "Have a good trip." "You too," I replied. Inside the airport, I moved through security and found my gate with plenty of time before boarding. Travelers rushed past with rolling luggage while announcements echoed through the terminal. I sent Rachel a simple message. "Boarding soon." Her response came almost immediately. "Everything ready." When the plane finally lifted off the runway, Chicago shrank beneath the clouds. The city looked calm from above, its streets forming quiet lines between rows of buildings. Somewhere down there, Justin was probably driving to work. Or maybe he was already planning another visit with Amanda. He believed the week ahead would give him privacy, freedom. But while he moved through his routine, something important was already happening behind the scenes. Rachel and her legal team were preparing the final filing. Bank accounts would soon be flagged. Financial activity would be restricted. And Justin would receive documents he never expected to see. The airplane leveled out above the clouds as the seatbelt sign turned off. A flight attendant began walking down the aisle offering drinks. I looked out the window and took a slow breath. For months, Justin had believed he was the one controlling the story. But the truth was far different. Because the moment my plane left the ground, the countdown to his collapse had already begun. The moment my plane lifted into the clouds, Justin believed he had 4 quiet days of freedom. What he didn't know was that the clock had already started. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Rachel had already filed the first set of legal documents with the court. The process moved quickly because everything had been prepared in advance. Temporary financial protection orders, asset disclosure requests, and the most important document of all, the divorce filing, while I sat quietly in seat 14A somewhere above the Midwest. A legal process had officially begun that Justin knew nothing about. When my flight landed in Seattle, the rain greeted us immediately. Gray clouds hung low over the city, and a cold drizzle covered the airport windows as passengers slowly made their way through the terminal. I collected my suitcase and took a taxi to the hotel where the training conference would be held. The lobby buzzed with business travelers checking in. People talked about meetings, presentations, and networking dinners. Normal things. I smiled politely at the receptionist and accepted my room key. But my attention kept drifting back to my phone. Around 3 p.m, Rachel finally called. "It's done," she said calmly. The words sent a small wave of adrenaline through my chest. "What happens now?" I asked. "The court processed the filing this morning," she explained. "Your husband will be officially served tomorrow." I sat down slowly on the edge of the hotel bed. "Tomorrow?" "Yes. A process server will deliver the documents to him directly." Her voice remained steady and professional. "Once he receives them, the financial restrictions activate immediately. He won't be able to move funds from your shared accounts." I pictured Justin's face when the papers reached him. Shock. Confusion. Panic. All the emotions he had been carefully avoiding for months. "Do you know where he'll be served?" I asked. Rachel gave a small pause before answering. "Our investigator confirmed he has dinner reservations tonight." "With Amanda?" "Yes." The confirmation made my stomach tighten. Not because I was surprised. Because Justin had chosen to spend the night with her while believing I was thousands of miles away focusing on work. Rachel continued. "The server will approach him tomorrow morning outside his office building." The timing was perfect. Public enough to make the moment unavoidable. Professional enough to prevent any dramatic reaction. "Once he receives the documents," Rachel added, "his bank accounts will automatically trigger review flags. Certain withdrawals will require court approval, meaning Justin couldn't simply move money to support Amanda or prepare a new household. His plans would stop instantly." After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes staring out the hotel window. Seattle's skyline stretched across the gray horizon while rain slid slowly down the glass. For months, Justin had believed he was writing the story. Now the narrative had changed. The next morning began with the first session of the conference. A large ballroom filled with professionals listening to presentations about industry trends and corporate strategies. I sat near the back of the room, pretending to focus on the speaker. But my attention stayed on my phone. Around 9:45 a.m. Chicago time, the message finally arrived. "Rachel, he's been served." My heart started beating faster. I stepped quietly into the hallway outside the ballroom and called her immediately. "What happened?" I asked. "The process server approached him outside his office building," Rachel explained. "Witnesses confirm he was completely blindsided." I leaned against the wall, trying to picture the scene. Justin stepping out of his car, walking toward the building entrance. Then suddenly a stranger calling his name and handing him a legal envelope. "What did he do?" I asked. "He tried to refuse the documents at first. But legally he can't. The server left them with him and confirmed the delivery." I could almost imagine Justin standing there in the parking lot holding the papers, reading the first line. "Petition for dissolution of marriage," Rachel continued. About 20 minutes later, he attempted to access one of the investment accounts. My breath caught slightly, and it was blocked. The court restrictions had already activated. Justin's financial safety net had disappeared in less than an hour. "What happened after that?" I asked. "He called the bank," Rachel said. "Then he called 2 different financial advisors." I closed my eyes briefly. The panic had already started. For months, Justin believed he could quietly transition into a new life with Amanda. But the legal system moved faster than he expected. Every shared account was now under review. Every financial transfer required authorization. His carefully planned future had just collided with reality. Rachel paused before speaking again. "There's one more thing." "What?" Our investigator confirmed Justin left the office early. "Where did he go?" Rachel hesitated only slightly. "To the maternity clinic. The same clinic where Amanda had her ultrasound appointments." "Of course." Justin's first instinct would be to run to her. To explain. To figure out what to do next. But the truth was simple. No matter what plan he tried to make now, it was already too late. Because the moment he opened that legal envelope, the life he thought he controlled had begun collapsing. And I was still 3,000 miles away. By the time Justin reached the maternity clinic, the reality of the situation had already started closing in around him. The legal envelope sat on the passenger seat of his car like something radioactive. He had opened it in the parking lot outside his office, scanning the first page in disbelief before reading it again more carefully. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words didn't make sense at first. Justin had always believed he would control the timing of everything. The affair with Amanda. The pregnancy. The eventual separation from me. He imagined those events unfolding gradually, in a way that protected him financially and emotionally. But now the timeline had been ripped away from him. When he tried accessing the brokerage account from his phone, the banking app displayed a warning message. Account activity temporarily restricted pending legal review. Justin stared at the screen, refreshing it several times as if the message might disappear. It didn't. That was when the first wave of panic hit. He drove directly to the maternity clinic where Amanda had her appointments, barely remembering the traffic lights he passed along the way. Inside the clinic waiting area, Amanda sat flipping through a magazine while resting one hand on her growing stomach. She looked up when Justin entered. "Hey," she said with a small smile. "You're early." Justin didn't smile back. He dropped into the chair beside her and placed the legal envelope on the table. "What's wrong?" Amanda asked. He pushed the papers toward her. "Read it." Amanda frowned and picked up the documents. Her expression changed as she scanned the first page. "Divorce," she said quietly. "Yes." "But you said that wasn't happening yet." Justin ran a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to." Amanda flipped through several more pages, confusion slowly turning into concern. "Wait," she said. "What does this part mean?" She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the document. Justin already knew what it meant. Temporary financial protections. Asset restrictions. Court oversight. "It means everything is frozen," he said quietly. Amanda blinked. "What do you mean frozen?" "Our accounts. Investments. Money." Amanda stared at him. "You said you had everything planned." "I did." "Then how did this happen?" Justin didn't answer immediately, because the truth was starting to become clear in his own mind. He had underestimated me. For months he assumed I knew nothing about Amanda. That assumption allowed him to keep building his second life quietly. Doctor appointments. Dinners. Hotel nights. Conversations about the baby. Now every one of those decisions was sitting inside legal evidence. Amanda placed the papers back on the table slowly. "So what happens now?" she asked. Justin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I need to talk to a lawyer." Amanda's voice sharpened slightly. "And the baby?" He looked up at her. "What about the baby? You said you were going to take care of everything." "I will." "But how?" she pressed. "If your money is frozen?" Justin didn't respond right away, because for the first time since the affair began, he didn't have an immediate answer. Back in Seattle, I sat in a quiet corner of the conference center cafe with a cup of coffee cooling beside my laptop. My phone buzzed with another update from Rachel. He contacted 3 attorneys already. I read the message slowly. That meant Justin had entered the panic phase. Rachel called a few minutes later. "He's trying to move quickly," she said. "But the financial restrictions limit what he can do." "What about the accounts?" I asked. All still flagged. He attempted another transfer this afternoon. And blocked. I nodded quietly even though she couldn't see me. "Good." Rachel continued explaining the next steps. Justin's attorneys would likely request temporary hearings to challenge some restrictions. But the evidence we gathered, especially the financial records connected to Amanda, gave us strong leverage. He used marital funds for the affair, Rachel said. That complicates his position significantly. I watched rain continue falling outside the cafe windows. Seattle felt calm, peaceful, but thousands of miles away. Justin's carefully constructed life was unraveling faster than he could repair it. Rachel paused for a moment before speaking again. There's something else. What? Our investigator confirmed he went directly to the maternity clinic after being served. I wasn't surprised. And Amanda, she was there. A quiet silence settled between us. Then Rachel added one more detail. Witnesses reported a pretty tense conversation. I imagined the scene. Justin explaining the divorce papers. Amanda realizing the financial situation had suddenly changed. Two people who believed they were building a future together, suddenly discovering the ground beneath them wasn't stable. Rachel's voice softened slightly. People panic when their plans collapse. I know. And when that happens, they make mistakes. That was the moment I understood something important. Justin had spent months building a secret life with Amanda, but those plans were based on one assumption, that I would remain unaware until he was ready. Now that assumption was gone, and without it, everything he built started falling apart. I closed my laptop and looked down at the city streets below the cafe window. Somewhere back in Chicago, Justin was trying to fix a disaster he never expected. But the truth was simple. The moment he opened that envelope, his future had already changed. He just hadn't realized yet how completely it would collapse. By the end of that afternoon, Justin's world no longer resembled the one he had been living in just 24 hours earlier. The legal documents sat open across the desk in his office while two different attorneys spoke with him over speakerphone. Each one asked nearly the same questions. When did you receive the papers? Have any assets been moved recently? Did your spouse gather financial records? Justin answered carefully. But the more he spoke, the clearer the situation became. His advantage was gone. The accounts were already flagged. His investment portfolio had entered a temporary review period. Even the brokerage firm handling his stock options had placed restrictions on withdrawals. One of the attorneys spoke bluntly. Right now, the court assumes both spouses must be protected from sudden financial changes. Justin rubbed his forehead. So how long does this freeze last? That depends on the judge, the lawyer replied. But usually until preliminary hearings. And that could take weeks, possibly longer. Justin ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Weeks. He had been planning a new life with Amanda that required money, stability, and time. Now all three had disappeared overnight. His phone buzzed again. Amanda. He answered immediately. Did you talk to a lawyer? She asked without greeting. Yes. And Justin hesitated. It's complicated. That doesn't sound good. It's temporary, he said quickly. Just legal procedures. Amanda didn't sound convinced. You said you were going to move out soon, she reminded him. We already talked about finding a place before the baby comes. Justin closed his eyes for a moment. I know. So what changed? He looked at the divorce documents again. She filed first, he said quietly. Amanda was silent for a few seconds. What does that mean? It means she was already preparing. But how? Justin didn't answer immediately, because the truth was starting to form clearly in his mind. I must have known far longer than he imagined. Amanda spoke again. Justin, if everything is frozen, how are we supposed to manage the next few months? I'll figure it out. How? I said I'll figure it out. His voice came out sharper than he intended. Amanda's tone cooled slightly. I'm just asking because the doctor appointments, the apartment we talked about, the baby expenses. Justin stood up and walked toward the window. I know what's coming, he said. Do you? Yes. Amanda sighed softly. I hope so. When the call ended, Justin stood quietly staring out over the city. For months, he believed the affair existed inside a controlled timeline. He would slowly distance himself from the marriage, Prepare financially. Transition into a new household with Amanda. But the divorce filing had shattered that timeline completely. Back in Seattle, the final afternoon of the conference passed slowly. People gathered for closing presentations while exchanging business cards and discussing future partnerships. The room buzzed with optimism and professional ambition. But my attention remained elsewhere. Rachel sent another update. He attempted to liquidate a small investment account. I replied quickly. What happened? Blocked again. I felt a small wave of relief. Justin was clearly scrambling for solutions. And every failed attempt confirmed that the legal protections were working. Rachel called shortly after. He's moving fast, she said. Trying to fix the damage. Yes. I leaned back in the chair. That means the pressure is working. Rachel agreed. When someone loses financial control unexpectedly, they start making decisions emotionally. And emotional decisions create mistakes. Exactly. She paused before adding something else. Our investigator also confirmed he met Amanda again this afternoon. Where? A cafe near the clinic. I imagined the conversation. Amanda asking questions. Justin promising solutions he wasn't sure he could deliver. Rachel continued. There was visible tension between them. That was inevitable. Relationships built during affairs often struggle when reality arrives. I understood what she meant. Justin and Amanda had built their connection inside secrecy and excitement. But now they faced legal battles, financial restrictions, and a child arriving in just a few months. Pressure reveals cracks quickly. After the call ended, I walked outside the conference center. Seattle's evening air felt cool and damp while city lights reflected off wet streets. For the first time since the investigation began, I felt something unexpected. Not revenge. Not anger. Control. Justin had spent months believing he controlled every outcome. But now every step he took was a reaction. Lawyers. Blocked accounts. Arguments with Amanda. And all of it started with one decision. The moment I chose to act first. My phone buzzed once more before I returned to the hotel. A short message from Rachel. He finally understands he's in serious trouble. I read the message slowly. Because the truth was, Justin had only just begun to understand. What he didn't realize yet was how much worse the situation was about to become. By the second day after being served the divorce papers, Justin finally understood that the situation was far more serious than he had first believed. The panic that followed the initial shock had begun turning into something heavier. Damage control. He spent most of the morning inside a law office downtown, sitting across from a senior attorney who had clearly handled cases like this many times before. Stacks of printed financial statements covered the table between them. The attorney flipped through the documents slowly. You and your wife share most major assets, he said. Yes. And she filed first? Justin nodded. That's not good for you. Justin leaned forward in his chair. I need to know what I can still do. The attorney tapped a page showing the brokerage account. Right now, the court has placed temporary protections on shared financial assets. I understand that, but what concerns me more, the attorney continued, is the documentation of marital funds used outside the marriage. Justin's jaw tightened slightly. Meaning, the attorney slid several pages toward him. Restaurant bills, hotel charges, clinic payments. These records suggest funds were used in connection with another relationship, he said carefully. Justin stared down at the pages. And, in divorce proceedings, that can influence asset distribution. Justin ran his hand through his hair again. So you're saying I could lose more than half? I'm saying the court will look closely at your financial behavior during the marriage. Justin sat back heavily in the chair. For the first time since the affair began, the consequences felt real. Not emotional consequences. Financial ones. Later that afternoon, he met Amanda again at the cafe near the clinic. She was already sitting at a small corner table when he arrived. The moment he sat down, she looked at his face and frowned. You look exhausted. Justin didn't bother pretending otherwise. I spent 3 hours with lawyers. And, he shook his head slowly. This is worse than I expected. Amanda's hand rested protectively over her stomach. What does that mean for us? Justin looked around the cafe briefly before lowering his voice. It means I don't have access to most of the money right now. Amanda blinked. You told me you had investments. I do. Then why can't you use them? Because the court froze the accounts. Her expression changed immediately. All of them. Most of them. Amanda leaned back in her chair. And the apartment we talked about. Justin didn't answer. She stared at him. You said we would move before the baby comes. I know. So how is that supposed to happen now? Justin rubbed his temples. I'm working on solutions. Amanda's voice hardened slightly. Working on solutions isn't the same as having one. Justin looked up at her. You think I don't understand that? Amanda sighed. I'm just saying, everything feels very uncertain suddenly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Because both of them were beginning to realize something uncomfortable. The future they imagined together depended heavily on Justin's financial stability. And that stability was now under legal control. Back in Seattle, my conference had officially ended. Most attendees spent the afternoon preparing for flights home or exploring the city before leaving. I sat in the hotel lobby reviewing a message Rachel had just sent. His attorneys are requesting an early hearing. I typed back immediately. Why? Because they want partial access to funds. I smiled faintly. That meant the pressure was working exactly as expected. Rachel called a few minutes later. He's trying to regain control, she explained. But the court usually moves slowly with these requests. How long? Possibly weeks. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Which means his situation continues tightening. Yes. Rachel paused before adding something else. There's another development. What happened? Our investigator confirmed Amanda visited a financial advisor yesterday. I raised an eyebrow. That's interesting. It suggests she's starting to worry about long-term stability. I leaned back in the chair. That made sense. Amanda had entered the relationship believing Justin was financially secure. Now the legal restrictions were revealing a very different reality. Rachel continued. Affair relationships often change quickly when financial uncertainty appears. I looked through the hotel window at the quiet Seattle street outside. Rain had stopped, leaving the pavement shining under streetlights. For months, Justin believed he had time. I said quietly. Yes. But time is exactly what he doesn't have now. Rachel agreed. The legal process moves on its own schedule once it starts. And Justin had lost the ability to control that schedule. After the call ended, I checked my return flight confirmation. Tomorrow morning I would fly back to Chicago. Back to the house. Back to the life Justin had tried to quietly replace. But this time the balance of power would be very different. Because the moment Justin received those divorce papers, the illusion he had been living inside began breaking apart. And now even Amanda was starting to see the cracks. What Justin didn't realize yet was that the final stage of the collapse was still coming. And when it arrived, there would be no way for him to stop it. The flight back to Chicago felt very different from the one that had taken me to Seattle. 4 days earlier, I had boarded the plane knowing a legal storm was about to begin. Now, as the aircraft descended through the gray Midwest clouds, that storm had already changed everything. Justin had spent the past few days scrambling to regain control of a life that no longer belonged entirely to him. The legal filings were active. The financial accounts were restricted. And the illusion he had carefully maintained for months had finally collapsed. When the plane touched down and rolled toward the terminal, I felt an unexpected calm settle inside me. Not relief. Not victory. Just clarity. Because for the first time since discovering the truth about Amanda, the future felt predictable again. I collected my suitcase and walked through the airport slowly while passengers rushed around me. Outside the terminal, the cold Chicago air felt sharper than the Seattle rain had been. I took a taxi home. During the ride, I watched the familiar streets pass by the window. Restaurants where Justin and I once had dinner together. Parks where Stephen had learned to ride his bike. The city looked exactly the same. But the life waiting for me inside that house had changed forever. Justin's car was already in the driveway when I arrived. That didn't surprise me. Rachel had told me earlier that morning Justin had taken several days off from work after receiving the divorce papers. He was probably inside trying to figure out what to do next. I carried my suitcase to the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. For a moment, I wondered if Justin had taken Steven somewhere. Then I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. Justin appeared in the living room doorway. He looked different. The confident calm he usually carried had been replaced by something heavier. Exhaustion. Confusion. Maybe even fear. "You're back," he said. "Yes." Neither of us moved closer. The silence stretched for several seconds before Justin finally spoke again. "Why didn't you tell me you knew?" I set my suitcase beside the door. "Because if I had," I said calmly, "you would have hidden everything." Justin looked down briefly. "So you just watched?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough." He let out a slow breath. "I didn't think you'd go straight to divorce." I held his gaze. "You didn't think I knew about Amanda." Justin flinched slightly at the name. "That's not how things were supposed to happen." I nodded slowly. "I know. Because that was the real truth behind everything." Justin had created a timeline where he controlled every outcome. He would reveal the affair when he was ready. Prepare his finances first. Build a new life before leaving the old one. But he forgot one simple fact. Other people get to make decisions too. And when someone lies long enough, eventually the person being lied to makes a decision of their own. Justin sat down heavily on the couch. "My lawyer said the accounts are frozen." "They are." "And the investments?" "Yes." He rubbed his face with both hands. "This is going to take months to fix." I didn't respond. Because the legal process wasn't designed to make things easy for people who created chaos. After a moment, Justin looked up again. "What happens now?" "The court process," I said. "And us?" I paused briefly before answering. "That ended months ago." Justin didn't argue. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed to understand that the situation had moved beyond persuasion or excuses. The choices had already been made. Later that evening, after Justin left to stay at a hotel, I sat alone in the quiet living room. Steven would return from my sister's house the next day. Life would continue. Different, but stable. I thought back to the moment months earlier when I first saw Amanda's message on Justin's phone. "Doctor confirmed today." 3 words. 3 words that had started the entire chain of events. Justin believed that message marked the beginning of his new life. But in reality, it marked the beginning of the end of his carefully constructed illusion. And the most important lesson from everything that happened wasn't about revenge. It was about awareness. Because the moment you stop ignoring the truth in front of you, everything changes. You stop reacting. You start deciding. And the person who once believed they controlled your future suddenly realizes they never truly did. If you've ever experienced betrayal, deception, or someone secretly building another life behind your back, you already know how powerful that moment of clarity can be. Sometimes the strongest response isn't anger. Sometimes it's preparation. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have confronted him immediately? Or would you have done the same thing, quietly gathering the truth first? And if you enjoy stories about justice, hidden truths, and the moment everything finally turns around, make sure to stay with the channel and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud at all. Sometimes it's simply the moment the truth walks into the room, and everything finally collapses. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.